Know, O Prince, that between the years when the oceans drank Atlantis and the gleaming cities, and the years of the rise of the sons of Arius, there was an age undreamed of, when shining kingdoms lay spread across the world like blue mantles beneath the stars. Nemedia, Ophir, Bithynia, Hyperborea, Zamora, with its dark-haired women and towers of spider-haunted mystery, Zingara with its chivalry, Koth that bordered on the pastoral lands of Shem, Stygia with its shadow-guarded tombs, Hyrcania, whose riders wore steel and silk and gold. But the proudest kingdom of the world was Aquilonia, reigning supreme in the dreaming west. Hither came Conan the Cimmerian, black-haired, sullen-eyed, sword in hand, a thief, a reaver, a slayer, with gigantic melancholies and gigantic mirth, to tread the jeweled thrones of the earth under his sandaled feet. So begins The Phoenix on the Sword, Robert E. Howard's first tale concerning his greatest literary creation, Conan of Cimmeria. Welcome to the Atlantic Archive, where we talk about books and shows and all things retro. You know, when I was first thinking about getting this channel started, I'd been watching BookTube for a while. I'd been watching review channels for a while where they talk about TV shows and movies and that sort of thing. And I decided that if I ever got into this and started my own channel and wanted to talk about these things for myself, one of the things that I would definitely do is cover introductions, the area of great introductions, novels and short stories and what have you. Things that just really jump off the page and immediately get you invested into a story and make you think, you know, this is something I want to read. This is something I want to find out what happens with this. There's an interesting story to be told here. And one of those, probably of all of those, I think The Phoenix on the Sword, this introduction that I just read here, was always going to be the first one that I covered because it is genuinely genius. I think it's absolutely brilliant piece of writing. And it turns out that this is a great time to do this. BookTube is celebrating Cimmerian September, an event created by Michael K. Vaughan over on his channel. Michael is a great Robert E. Howard fan in general and a fan of Conan in particular, and he created this event, Cimmerian September. So I decided, since I'm getting involved in all of this, to just go right ahead and jump on in. And I would start out covering great intros with the beginning to The Phoenix on the Sword, which fits with the theme for the month. If you haven't seen Michael's channel, he's my favorite booktuber, I have to admit. If you haven't seen his channel, I'll put a link in below. I highly recommend checking him out. Him and Roger over at Stately Vaughan Manor. He goes into a great deal of detail on Robert E. Howard, not just Conan, but the other characters he created like Solomon Kane and Bran MacMore. He goes into some of Howard's historical fiction. And he has a feature he calls the Robert E. Howard Show, where he talks about Howard's books and tales and about Howard himself. Howard was an interesting guy. Had an unfortunately short life. Born in 1906, I think died in 1936, so he died at the age of 30. He committed suicide, unfortunately. It's a tragic end. Howard was a brooding figure, much like a couple of his great creations, Kull and Conan. He had a very dark, brooding side to his nature, and that comes out in his writing. I think Michael Vaughan has said that he thinks Howard's character, Kull, the conqueror, Kull of Atlantis, is probably very close to being kind of an autobiographical sketch of Howard himself. I think Conan is probably more who Howard might have wanted to be, whereas Kull is who Howard probably actually was. It was more of a closer look at his psyche of who he was. Kull being more the philosopher king, the thinking figure. Conan is by no means an idiot. He is not, as Howard said in a letter to Lovecraft, dead from the neck up. He's a smart guy. He's a very clever guy. He's very intelligent. But he's not, in the stories that Howard wrote, given to the philosophical brooding that Kull gets into. And that's probably because the Kull stories were not as successful, and Conan, on the other hand, really took off. He was a very successful character for Howard. His stories are much more action-packed, so you don't get a whole lot of time where Conan slows down and gives us deep thoughts. As a matter of fact, he doesn't even really say much about his own background or those of his people. We actually get a little bit of a glimpse of that in this first story, the Phoenix on the Sword, and we just don't get much elsewhere. Cimmerians have a fearsome reputation. We learn that they come from the far north, from a dark land, and that they're often at war with tribes that are even farther to the north than them, but we just don't get too much into that. Conan does give a little bit of a description there in the Phoenix on the Sword, and I'm actually going to read an excerpt from that in just a minute here. But yeah, the first Conan story, and I've got the Del Rey version here. This is the version that Michael Vaughan is reading as well. This comes in a 3-volume set and contains Robert E. Howard's complete original Conan writings, including all of the fragments, things that he started but never quite finished. There's a great introduction to it here, and also at the very beginning, a poem that Howard wrote called Cimmeria, where he goes into a little bit about the place where Conan comes from. And that gives you a little bit of background there. So definitely worth the effort of getting these volumes and owning those if you have any interest in Howard or in Conan in particular. It's great stuff. It's the pure original Conan restored as Howard wrote it. And it's always important, at least to me as a writer myself, it's important to get the author's original vision. Pastiche fiction, is great. It's always great to have people building on your own worlds. I mean, Howard took some of the things that others at other weird writers of the era were using and built his own stories into that framework. He, Lovecraft, and Clark Ashton Smith, they kind of the big three, if you want to call that, the grand masters of the weird tales franchise. These guys built on one another's work. Lovecraft especially encouraged that. He has his own Cthulhu mythos, and a lot of other writers have tapped into it over time. It's great to see people do that sort of thing, but you always want to go back and get the writer's original vision for what it was that he or she was trying to do. So that's what these Del Rey volumes really get you into, is Howard's original vision for Conan. And again, just a spectacular piece of writing there at the very beginning. One of the most brilliant intros I've ever read it anywhere in anything. Howard's writing is, he's known as being a pulp writer, of course. Pulp writers often have a bad reputation for being schlock artists, whatever. And, you can see why some of that is. Howard was, I think, the best of them. And his writing really ranges from, it's kind of all over the map. You get brilliant stuff like this, and then you get other efforts where you can see Howard was probably, writing another Conan story because it would be popular and get him a check, as opposed to something that maybe he was really invested in or being really creative. He wasn't maximizing his creative potential with some of those stories. One that stands out to me is Zalthul of the Dusk. It's not one of the best Conan stories by any means. But you get the action, and that's what sold. That's what Weird Tales and other magazines seemed to want at the time. They wanted brawny guys rescuing pretty girls from monsters and all that sort of thing. And Howard stories, in some cases, do definitely provide that. Howard is not, you don't get bored reading his material, let's put it that way. There's always something going on. There's always some action, or his descriptions always bring you in to the story. This beginning of this Del Rey volume here, it's got this blurb from Stephen King at the top, just talking about Howard and his work. And whatever you think of Stephen King and what King has written, I think this is extremely accurate. Stephen King says here, Howard's writing is charged with energy, so much that it nearly gives off sparks. And I think that's absolutely accurate. That's dead on. When you're reading Howard's short stories, especially his Conan and Solomon Kane fiction and some of his historical fiction, you get the sense, you can almost hear the clash of swords in the background and the screams of damsels in distress and the roar of monsters. And from what I understand, Howard himself actually wrote some of these stories out loud. He would be banging away on his old-fashioned typewriter, and he'd be yelling out the dialogue and the description, that sort of thing. And I can totally see that reading some of these stories. Again, the writing is uneven. It's all over the place. You get some really brilliant material, and then you get stuff that's just much more workman in nature. And one thing about Howard's stories, I tried to describe them to somebody one time. You get a sense in tales like Zalthul and some of the lesser works that he did that were just much more I'm going to write an action story, throw some monsters and some scantily clad damsels into it and that sort of thing. You almost get the sense you're reading something that was written by a 12-year-old boy who's just discovered girls and weightlifting. But at other times, it rises to real creative genius. Howard, again, all over the map with that kind of stuff. And you get your insights again into Conan here. The Phoenix on the Sword, this first Conan story, is actually a reworked story from another character, that King Kull character that I mentioned before. There was a story that Howard had written called By This Axe I Rule, which is the Kull story. And the Phoenix on the Sword is a reworking of that. Howard was not able to sell the story, so he rewrote it with Conan instead of Kull, and he added more supernatural elements to it than were in the Kull story. And it sold there. The Kull stories, by the way, are excellent stories. There's the Del Rey volume for that. Kull, again, a very different figure in some ways. He's much more of your philosopher king. He's been a barbarian. He comes from a similar background as Conan. And you reach him at this point in his life where he's more settled and looking back on his history. And that's really what you get with Conan in the Phoenix on the Sword as well. But there are some excellent stories in the Kull volume. If you've never read any of these, they're well worth reading. The Shadow Kingdom, the first, I think, Kull story that Robert E. Howard wrote, I may be wrong about that, but I think it was, is considered by some to be the first sword and sorcery story. There it is, opening pages on the Del Rey volume with the illustration there, Kull riding with his army in a parade through the streets of the capital city, Valusia, there, of his kingdom. And something I thought would be interesting here, again, in the Phoenix on the Sword, you get a little bit more of philosophizing Conan than you get elsewhere. And he begins to talk about his background a little bit and where he finds himself. Conan has been this adventurer. He's been a thief. He's been a mercenary in his past, in his youth. He's gone around slaying, as he says, and having adventures from one place to another. And now, in the Phoenix on the Sword, he's a king. He's a ruler. He's a civic authority. And he's a more mature person at this point. And he's looking back and he's kind of pining for the old days, because Conan, as intelligent as he is, he doesn't really get the trappings of civilization. He doesn't get the ceremonies. He sees a lot of debauchery hiding behind titles, and he sees the people that inhabit some of these civilized kingdoms as being foolish and caught up in the trappings of their own society to the point where they don't see reality. And you get a glimpse of that in here. And I think it's very interesting, worth reading here. So I'll go ahead and read this section. This is where Robert E. Howard introduces Conan for the first time. And matter of fact, he doesn't even name him. He just portrays him as a man sitting at a table. And then this man that he's talking to, one of his aides, and apparently a trusted confidant, Prospero is his name, actually names him for us. And that's the first time that we see the name here. So I'll go ahead and read just this section, which I find particularly interesting and I think very well written. Prospero, said the man at the table, these matters of statecraft weary me as all the fighting I have done never did. All part of the game, Conan, answered the dark-eyed Pointanian. You are king. You must play the part. I wish I might ride with you to Nemedia, said Conan enviously. It seems ages since I have had a horse between my knees, but Publius says that affairs in the city require my presence. Curse him. When I overthrew the old dynasty, he continued, speaking with the easy familiarity which existed only between the Pointanian and himself, it was easy enough, though it seemed bitter hard at the time. Looking back now over the wild path I followed, all those days of toil, intrigue, slaughter, and tribulation seem like a dream. I did not dream far enough, Prospero. When King Numidides lay dead at my feet and I tore the crown from his gory head and set it on my own, I had reached the ultimate border of my dreams. I had prepared myself to take the crown, not to hold it. In the old free days, all I wanted was a sharp sword and a straight path to my enemies. Now no paths are straight and my sword is useless. When I overthrew Numidides, then I was the liberator. Now they spit at my shadow. They have put a statue of that swine in the temple of Mitra, and people go and wail before it, hailing it as the holy effigy of a saintly monarch who was done to death by a red-handed barbarian. When I led her armies to victory as a mercenary, Aquilonia overlooked the fact that I was a foreigner. But now she cannot forgive me. Now in Mitra's temple there come to burn incense to Numidides' memory men whom his hangmen maimed and blinded, men whose sons died in his dungeons, whose wives and daughters were dragged into his seraglio, the fickle fools. Just for fun, again, since this was adapted from a King Kull story, I wanted to read this passage, almost verbatim in some ways, from the Kull story by this Axe I Rule, just so you can kind of judge the difference in how Howard changed this a little bit. And you can already see the differences in the characters, the characterization of Kull as going into Conan. So this, again, by this Axe I Rule. Brule, said the king, this matter of statecraft wearies me, as all the fighting I have done never did. A part of the game, Kull, answered Brule. You are king, you must play the part. I wish that I might ride with you to Grondar, said Kull enviously. It seems ages since I've had a horse between my knees, but Tu says that affairs at home require my presence. Curse him. Months and months ago, he continued with increasing gloom, getting no answer and speaking with freedom, I overthrew the old dynasty and seized the throne of Valusia, of which I had dreamed ever since I was a boy in the land of my tribesmen. That was easy. Looking back now of the long, hard path I followed, all those days of toil, slaughter, and tribulation seemed like so many dreams. From a wild tribesman in Atlantis I rose, passing through the galleys of Lemuria, a slave for 2 years at the oars, then an outlaw in the hills of Valusia, then a captive in her dungeons, a gladiator in her arenas, a soldier in her armies, a commander, a king. The trouble with me, Brule, I did not dream far enough. I always visualized merely the seizing of the throne. I did not look beyond. When King Borna lay dead beneath my feet and I tore the crown from his gory head, I had reached the ultimate border of my dreams. From there, it has been a maze of illusions and mistakes. I prepared myself to seize the throne, not to hold it. When I overthrew Borna, then people hailed me wildly. Then I was the liberator. Now they mutter and stare blackly behind my back. They spit in my shadow when they think I am not looking. They have put a statue of Borna, that dead swine, in the temple of the serpent, and people go and wail before him, hailing him as a saintly monarch who was done to death by a red-handed barbarian. When I led her armies to victory as a soldier, Valusia overlooked the fact that I was a foreigner. Now she cannot forgive me. And now in the temple of the serpent there come to burn incense to Borna's memory, men whom his executioners blinded and maimed, fathers whose sons died in his dungeons, husbands whose wives were dragged into his seraglio. Bah! Men are all fools. So there you get a glimpse of Kull, and you see how Howard later adapted that into the Phoenix on the Sword and changed the character to Conan. You begin to see a little bit of difference between the two men. And again, Conan, as he's talking to Prospero in the Phoenix on the Sword, he goes into talking a little bit about his people. And I think that this is interesting here. He's talking about various peoples surrounding the kingdom of Aquilonia, and gets into discussing with Prospero where he comes from. And it's interesting. Prospero makes this statement regarding Cimmerians and how Conan is different from any that he's encountered before. Then I think you are like them, laughed Prospero. You laugh greatly, drink deep, and bellow good songs, though I never saw another Cimmerian who drank aught but water, who ever laughed, who ever sang, save to chant a dismal dirge. Perhaps it's the land they live in, answered the king. A gloomier land never was, all of hills, darkly wooded under skies nearly always gray, with winds moaning drearily down the valleys. Little wonder men grow moody there, quoth Prospero, with a shrug of his shoulders, thinking of the smiling, sun-washed plains and blue, lazy rivers of Pointain, Aquilonia's southernmost province. They have no hope here or hereafter, answered Conan. Their gods are Crom and his dark race, who rule over a sunless place of everlasting mist, which is the world of the dead, Mitra. The ways of the Aesir were more to my liking. So you get that little glimpse there of Conan in the rather dark place and moody people that he comes from, people who don't seem to have much of a lust for life, either here or any dreams of the hereafter in their service to their dark god Crom. made famous mostly by the Conan the Barbarian movie with Arnold Schwarzenegger. Speaking of which, the intro to the Phoenix on the Sword, those of you who have seen the original Conan the Barbarian, you'll remember those lines being, some of those lines from that introduction at least, they stapled a little bit of together, being read by Mako. At the very beginning, you've got that dark background and the drum beat going on there, and then it goes into the famous sequence there with the forging of the sword, and it's so well done, cinematically just epic. It's Conan is a gargantuan, epic figure. Again, as Howard describes him there in the prologue, a man of gigantic melancholies and gigantic mirth. Everything about him is gigantic. He himself is gigantic, physically imposing. Anyone who sees him is awed by him. You know, at first sight, this great barbarian from the North Country. And just a larger-than-life figure who has cut a larger-than-life trail across several different forms of media. It starts out with short stories, one novel. Howard wrote one novel about Conan called The Hour of the Dragon, which is very similar to another short story that he had written called The Scarlet Citadel, which is one of the best of the Conan stories. And he seems to have adapted that and lengthened it and drawn it out into The Hour of the Dragon. And it's interesting, you know, as I go through these, Howard, again, he was only 30 years old when he died, and it was absolutely astonishing how much he was able to write and how much of it is quality writing. Again, you get some of that pulpy stuff in there and action and saving scantily clad women in distress, all that kind of thing that'll make you grin. Real comic book type stuff in novelized form. And of course, Conan was a very successful comic run. A lot of people, I think over 200 issues, at least in one form, and then another issue that was released. So he does have that comic, that cinematic flair. It's all epic. And again, you can hear Howard I can hear him as his parents must have with the door shut, and as they're out in the house and they hear this furious typing going on in the other room, and Howard himself yelling out the dialogue and stuff. It makes for good theater all by itself. And there was a movie made about Robert E. Howard's life. Actually, my wife came home one night and was asking me about Howard, and I was like, how in the world have you heard about him? Because she doesn't read stuff like this. And she said that she had seen the movie with, I guess, Renee Zellweger, and I can't remember the guy who plays Howard. It's called The Whole Wide World, I think is what the name of the movie was. Forgive me if I'm wrong on that. But yeah, Howard is just such a larger-than-life figure himself, living there in Cross Plains, Texas, where so many people were more of a conservative mindset, and Howard had this adventuresome mind. It's amazing that he himself never really traveled and got out there. He has, in a way, a kind of that quality that Jimmy Stewart has in It's a Wonderful Life. He wants to shake the dust of this crummy little town off his feet and see the world. Unfortunately, something that Howard never got to do, although he did correspond widely with other writers like H.P. Lovecraft, and had his horizons broadened in his discussions and debates with those people. But he would have been a fascinating person to know, I think. He seems like one of those guys who was just full of intensity and had to get it out, and he chose this literary form to get out the gigantic adventures that were going on in his mind when so much around him was just pedestrian in his view. And it came to such a tragic end in his suicide, and it would have been interesting to see what Howard would have done after that. He was writing a lot of Westerns at the time. Maybe he would have gone into that. Some people speculated he would have given up the sword and sorcery stuff for adventure. I think he would have gone off more into some science fiction as well, since that was so popular at the time and only becoming more popular. I think he would have gone more into that. And ultimately, it would have been interesting to see him perhaps come back to revisit characters like Kull and Conan, just to see what a more mature Howard would have thought years down the road as a more experienced writer, having more experience in life. He never married, never had any real serious long-term relationships or anything like that. He did have a relationship with a girl named Novaline Price, and that's kind of a murky subject. Nobody really knows exactly what went on there. He doesn't seem to have invested himself too greatly in that. It would have been interesting just to see how Howard matured as a man and a writer, and how he would have looked back on his old work with Conan and his other characters, and how he might have later revived them. It would have been interesting to see if he had done anything else about King Conan and how he would have handled affairs. The Phoenix on the Sword, again, does concern King Conan, and it concerns in particular a plot to overthrow him, to kill him. And I won't go into it too much to spoil it. I encourage you to get in there and read it. If you've never read Howard, this is a great place to start. There are some stories I definitely would not recommend. Howard was a writer, a thinker of his time, obviously. He was shaped by that world. Some people will have, a real difficult time with some of his portrayals, including the treatment of women. They don't come off all that well in some of his stories. Although Howard did write a really great female warrior figure, Dark Agnes, in his Swordwoman stories. It would have been interesting to see him do more than that, more with that. She's a great character and more fully fleshed out than the kind of female characters that Conan is usually rescuing, who are just there to wear very little and serve as something to get Conan into trouble, basically. Women in this sort of fiction, women in all the fiction of that time, which was mostly written by men, particularly adventure stories, women were just usually figures to be rescued, to be tied to railroad tracks and saved by a hero, that kind of thing. Very nostalgic flavor. Great stories still in many cases. And Howard will surprise you with his writing. It was more sophisticated than you would imagine. And the prose is much better done than most people would associate with with pulp writing. At times, yes, you do smile. Conan has got the panther-like quickness, the tiger-like reflexes, the iron thews, the various descriptive terms that Howard uses will make you smile. But it never fails to entertain. Again, as Stephen King says, Howard's writing seems so highly charged with energy that it nearly gives off sparks. Absolutely correct. So, by Crom, if you've never read Howard and you've never read Conan, celebrate Cimmerian September with Michael Vaughn and other members of BookTube, and dive in to some Robert E. Howard. Pick up the Conan volumes from Del Rey. You can get them in the paperback. I understand these are also available as ebooks, which would be great too. You get all, again, the original Conan material, and you may want to branch out and read some other stuff like the Kull stories. Some of Howard's material, oddly enough, he wrote a lot in addition to these. Again, he was into other things like Westerns. He wrote boxing stories, all that kind of thing. And some of his stories are much different than what you'll read in Conan, for instance. Probably one of his most famous stories, Pigeons from Hell, which I held off reading for a while because I was kind of thrown by that title. It just doesn't sound like it'd be something worth reading. It's actually really, really well done. It's a short horror story. And frankly, if I didn't know who the author was, I would not have guessed Howard. The writing is really good. And it doesn't have that pulpy flavor that a lot of Conan does, which is also good. Don't want to denigrate Howard, by any means. There are genres. You write in a particular genre, and Howard himself is pretty well credited with starting Sword and Sorcery. Again, that Kull story he wrote, the very first Kull story, again, I think that it was, The Shadow Kingdom is thought to be the actual first Sword and Sorcery story, and it's fantastic. So if you're writing in a genre, you're going to use the format of the genre, but every once in a while it gets elevated to another level and becomes something truly special. And that's what Howard did with his Conan stories, especially starting there, The Phoenix on the Sword, such a great example, some of the best writing that he ever did, and one of the best looks you get at one of the most famous characters in modern literature. So, wanted to start off definitely with going into one of the great intros in all the literature I've ever read, and in honor of Cimmerian September, I thought it would be great to start with this excerpt from The Phoenix on the Sword and the Legacy of Conan and Robert E. Howard. So, until next time, thank you for watching. Please like the video if you did in fact like it. Subscribe to the channel, leave me a comment. Maybe all these things help channels grow. The more I'm able to do with this, hopefully I'll have some more interactions with people online. I do enjoy the BookTube community and the channel, the review channels, all that sort of thing out there. It's great stuff. Looking forward to discussing it with all of you out there. So take care. God bless.
Conan, what is best in life? To crush your enemies, see them driven before you, and to hear the lamentation of your women. That is good. That is good.